Nadine, David, thanks for joining me here at beautiful LSI 2022.
It's great to be here.
Pleasure, Joe.
And both of you, I'm really excited about chatting about this because this is the 20,000 foot view of what health tech, healthcare is looking at right now. And of course, a Lyra background and Proximie background. Both of you are insiders and outsiders from a classic medical device perspective, right? So I was curious on both of your thoughts on these subjects we're going to talk about today. So Elsevier came out with a study today. It's actually a pretty powerful report. It's Clinician of the Future. And they were looking at what's been going on in healthcare today and what are the tail wagging the dog. So I want to throw out a couple things here and we want to talk about it. So the global study found 71% of doctors and 68% of nurses believe their jobs have changed considerably in the past 10 years, with many of them saying their jobs have gotten worse. So you're a surgeon and a technologist, and you are servicing the health tech community at a scale that I don't think anybody has as of yet on the Proximie side. So what are your thoughts on that, both as a surgeon and a business person?
I think we can't deny the fact, as a surgeon, of course, working on the front line, is that that supply-demand gap continues to grow. And the current models of care are starting to prove that they're limited in terms of how future-proof they are. We've really tried to squeeze as much of this system as we can, but we're starting to really hit those friction points where it's becoming really clear that the standard models have limitations, and ultimately, and particularly since COVID, that supply-demand gap has grown, pretty significantly. It's actually a major inflection point, which is, worrying and concerning from a kind of hospital perspective or a clinical team perspective, and that how are we ever going to kind of bridge that gap? How are we going to close that gap? And doing more of the same isn't going to solve the problem. And so there are challenges around being overwhelmed, stretched to the extreme, squeezed to the extreme, and how do we try and address that? We need to think more laterally, more disruptively, to think about how do we change that. And I think one of the things we saw particularly, of course, made clear during COVID, it wasn't like the problem wasn't there, it's just it really put a magnifying glass on the problems that your typical kind of bricks and mortar approach to healthcare can only take you so far. That compounded by, people leaving healthcare, burnout, emotionally drained through all the process, is something we really need to think about. And I've obviously got some thoughts around that, but I think at that sort of 30,000 foot view, those I think are the immediate challenges we need to start addressing if we're going to be able to continue to deliver the care we want to deliver in the next even 5 years, let alone 10, 20, 30 years.
David, you deal a lot with technology, especially. Your areas of expertise are that digital side, the data side, the robotics side. What do you see as that challenge going on right now with the healthcare community?
Look, I've made the transition 25 years on the manufacturer and equipment and device side to consulting, and it's the same challenge of, I'm not market research. We take market research and use that to make data analytics and intelligence and recommendations, and we're the same thing in clinical practice. Fortunately, our clinicians are being afforded opportunities to use so many new technologies, which is great. The downside of that is there are so many new technologies, and that's why we see some of the burnout going, that you can have a first assist or a scrub nurse with so many different pieces of equipment to learn, to train on, to understand how to operate, to prepare, to hand off to the next clinician in practice, and that's a lot. When you're talking about data, there's raw data in our industry right now. We're giving the clinicians and all of their staff so much raw data. And it's nice to have the data, but then you have to stop, pause, interpret, and understand how you're going to use that. And we haven't made meaningful use out of this data, taking it from what I was saying, I use market research to make recommendations. We haven't taken the raw data, manipulated it, or put it into an algorithm that uses artificial intelligence, uses machine learning, takes more interpretation, understands that, and doesn't dictate by any means to a clinician what to do, but makes recommendations or gives them meaningful information that they can process more rapidly and more meaningfully with a better clinical outcome, with a better procedure, with a better utilization of whatever technology they've been adapting?
I mean, I'd love to add one point to your first comment, then one to your second. I mean, on the first comment, I think you're absolutely right. Like, feeling supported, coached, mentored through this just plethora of new devices. I mean, there's some graphs out there to just show you the new technologies, the new techniques that clinical teams have to acquire is exponentially growing. Every other month we hear about a new device that comes to market, or a new system, or a new technique. And we need to make sure that the teams behind that need to deliver that are supported, trained, coached, and mentored to deliver that. And from my experience, having worked and supported training for medical device companies for many years, it was really part of the impetus that made me start Proximie, to think about how can we provide more of a crowdsourcing opportunity to share the knowledge together and support the training and upskilling rapidly of these teams. If you're a scrub tech or a first assist with a big, new orthopedic tray of a whole new set of kit, I mean, it can be quite daunting, let alone the doctor that has to use it, let alone the juniors that are training alongside them. So really thinking through how you bring in and almost better understand the ethnography of the operating room and pull that all in, I think is really important. And I think we've tried to bridge that with Proximie, and we've shown that we can accelerate that time to training by 60%. And that is one way that we can try to sort of bridge that. But on the other side, in terms of the being overwhelmed by data, I think clinical teams don't want another dashboard. Like, that's not what we're looking for. More and more dashboards, more and more charts that tell us just a lot of data and information. It's how do we then interpret that into what is it really telling us? I can have a lot of graphs and charts that tell me things, but what is it actually telling me about the care we're delivering, the optimization, the effectiveness of how we're treating our patients, and the clinical diagnostics that we need to sort of deliver behind that. So, when we look at sort of raw data, there's a lot of raw data out there. But how do we actually synthesize that to something really meaningful that is going to shift the trajectory of care and the pace of care, I think is really how we should be starting to look at data. And, the kind of the avenue of data and analytics and AI in healthcare is still nascent. We're still learning, and there's a lot to grow in there. But I would really urge people to really think about what question are we trying to answer, and how does that shift the trajectory of care on the back of it?
Pablo Garcia from Verb Surgical, Pablo is one of the early Yodas of digital. And Pablo said last year at SDTS in Houston, at Eric's meeting, said, everybody's talking about data, but nobody can agree upon the language of data right now. Like, if I say cat, everybody can envision a cat in their head. And if I say yellow bus, you got it. But we're irresponsibly throwing around the word data in the med tech, health tech industry. And we're also applying data right now, and I wonder what both your opinions are on this. It seems like most of our data fixation is on the acute procedure itself. And are we spending enough time on both ends of that, pre and post-operatively, on what outcomes mean? So what are your thoughts on that, and especially in the robotic world where you carry some really good experience?
Yeah, we talked about this a few months ago, Joe, and it's the entire perioperative process that you have to take into account. You can do a perfect surgery. You can have a surgeon and all their staff do something absolutely perfect, textbook in the OR, but maybe the patient wasn't prepped properly and they came in suboptimal. They were undernourished. They were not prepped right. They are going to end up with a post-operative infection because of prep. Or after they're completed in the OR, the post-op, or maybe even at discharge, or even the care following discharge is suboptimal. It all goes back to, well, what was it, the surgical procedure, or the surgeon doesn't care, it's their patient. They're not gonna have a great outcome. So it has to be the entire process, perioperative, pre, during, and post, and through discharge. One of the clinicians said, I do such great care at this institution with all the staff, and we wheel them so caringly in a wheelchair to the door, and then wave goodbye and hope they do well.
Right. Where's the data follow up there?
Yeah.
So here's an interesting stat while we're on data. Clinicians predict that over the next 10 years, technology literacy will become their most valuable capability, ranking it higher than clinical knowledge, which is really interesting. In fact, 56% of clinicians predict they will base most of their clinical decisions using tools that utilize AI. However, 69% report being overwhelmed with the current volume of data in the digital health technologies, and it's even becoming more of a burden than helping. As a result, 83% believe training needs to be overhauled so they can keep pace with technological advancements. So are we trying to improve a system that should be thrown out anyway in the first place? Right, we're putting data on a model that hasn't changed in over 120 years, surgery. And we're overlaying data analytics on that. Should we look at it, healthcare being more than just a nurse and a doctor? And can we change and start to higher fidelity talent pool within the healthcare system? Now, you deal with that every day.
I mean, I think there, two things stood out to me from the point. I mean, one on the technical literacy, which we'll talk about, but I think we need to be careful not to over-index, like you said, in the current model, the role that AI is going to play in the current model. I mean, there's definitely a promise of what AI is going to deliver in surgery, but we have yet to see what that is going to actually do. And yes, it can be useful in very distinct cases about, identifying specific paths or anatomical structures or others, but, just layering in AI into surgical workflow and just assuming it's all going to kind of work is challenging. And we haven't seen that really take off. We've been hearing about AI in surgery for quite a while now, and it hasn't really taken off because the underlying infrastructure doesn't exist. And this was something I thought about with Proximie years ago. I remember it was 2014. I was sitting in my OR thinking, this is a hugely analog, undigitized environment. And I really echo your point on the pre and the post-op, because the connected surgical care has to happen. It can't just be in the OR, it's everything. And so focusing on, building AI algorithms on some videos of an operating room independently are interesting and academic, at this point at best, but they're not going to shift the way we deliver care unless we really think holistically about, how are we going to generate enough, data sets, the fidelity, the heterogeneity of the data sets so you eliminate bias. How do we make sure that these algorithms are sustainable? There's still a lot of thinking that has to happen. How do we make sure the labeling is standardized? What Pablo talked about when we were at that same meeting together. And so what I decided to really focus on back then is, let's not try to, what I always say, put the cart before the horse. Let's not try to get to the AI, but let's first build the foundation. Like, have we actually built the foundation, the data pipelines that connect the operating rooms, the pre-op, the post-op, the data layer that brings it all together? And we haven't. And so it's still sitting in quite a silo, the AI element. And that's why I think in that approach, it's going to be very hard for it to just disrupt surgery, and we haven't seen it happen yet. And most clinicians are still quite skeptical, if you talk to surgeons, about the role that AI in and of itself will play. The bit that I think is also more important is the technical literacy. When we look at medical school programs, look way upstream, before you get into the surgeon completing his training, but even at medical school, even in that early intern year, are the programs being redesigned to include technical literacy, to include medtech, digital softwares and others? They haven't yet at large. There are areas and pockets that are doing a good job of pulling it in, but I think that's the bit we need to overhaul. And it's not just medical school, it's nursing programs, it's physician's assistant programs. We're talking about AI, and yet the nurse on the ward is still filling out a clipboard or at best an iPad. So, there's a big disconnect still.
Dave, do you think if we started all over again, would the healthcare system be designed as it is today if we had a blank sheet of paper with what we know today?
No, I think we're so inefficient. It could not start from where it is today. I think that's where we're struggling to evolve it, because we're at such a nearly broken system. And look, I'm always hopeful that there's ways to improve things. So when I say nearly broken, we've got a lot of issues with the system. The disparity between different standards of care and access to care. But not only just that, the amount of information that we're able to use when somebody enters the system. They could have been at 4 different touch points in the healthcare system, and you're starting to ask the same questions that has already been populated into another system. So no, I don't think we would have started from where we are today whatsoever. I remember 15 years ago, somebody showed me a little barcode on the back of a driver's license, said, here's what I'm trying to build for a user health information system. There's a lot of HIPAA requirements, and it's a whole day seminar to have that discussion, but we don't have access to patient information. So how do they make meaningful decisions even when they're getting more data and inputs that Nadine was just talking about? I mean, I'm very hopeful that this is going to transform the industry. You know, people use information every day, and it evolves every decade, Joe. You know, you look at SpO2. You didn't have that parameter 40 years ago. You're looking at different pieces of information that everybody has to learn how to use. It's not going to replace a clinician. You're saying clinical decisions will be less important than learning how to use data. You're still going. That's why they're clinicians here. They're still going to have to make medical decisions based on their clinical knowledge. Their clinical knowledge will direct that care based on the inputs they get. And they use inputs all day today, every day with their decision making, based with their clinical knowledge. And that I don't think will ever change.
But what
They'll have more
let me challenge that for a second. Let me challenge that for a second. So the clinical knowledge by the 10,000-hour surgeon takes that surgeon 25 years, 30 years to accumulate. And he or she gets an algorithm. Well, why can't I use narrow AI? Let's be smart here. AI in general is not really usable. But if I can take narrow AI and give it to a 3-year-out surgeon, she's just out, now she's in surgery for 3 years, and I can take that 50 years of surgery and then give it to her clinically for her to get advisement on. She still picks strategy. Right, because strategy in the surgery, right? You're a surgeon, so you can have all the clinical data you want in a highly predictable environment, and you can make the chest move from here to here. But what happens when things go sideways?
That's the point. That's the exact point I was going to talk to you, Joe. You can say that I don't need clinicians making decisions in the middle because we could automate, we could standardize everything. But these are human bodies that are unpredictable, and everybody is different. We are not homogeneous by any means. Now you can say for 60%, for 80%, this approach will work great. What happens when it doesn't? And that's where the clinicians become very much involved. So you can have a specialist or you can have a generalist. A specialist is there for your more difficult or more nuanced cases. But even with the generalist, when something goes south, you're going to want a clinician making decisions, not an algorithm.
Well,
They could get more information and inputs that are going to be helpful to that decision making, but they have to make a clinical decision.
but if the clinician that you want bedside with you, you know, in the middle of a procedure, and she has 20,000 hours and thousands of procedural experience, she basically is an algorithm, an inefficient one, but she's an algorithm. And so if I could take all that learning from all these cases, and you and I wax on robotics all the time, all those learning on all those cases, and I can put them as an advisement on the screen with that new 3-year surgeon there who might not have the 20,000-hour expert next to them. I'm actually giving them more than that, and I'm giving them a machine who makes less clinical mistakes than somebody who is working purely on their own algorithm. Doesn't that add value to the equation? And isn't that actually better than the surgeon bedside who's got all those procedures? I don't know.
It adds value without question. Example, you're in a procedure and the blood pressure is going down and you turn to the anesthesiologist, say, I think I've lost some blood, call it. How much blood do we need to give a unit? You're guessing. It's pixelated today with some technologies that you can say 700 ml or you're up to a liter 0.3. So you can actually do that today, but technology didn't tell you that before. And you could say, we need to add a unit of blood now. But that's still a decision. If I think I bring too much volume to the patient, I'm going to have respiratory issues. And these are clinical decisions. We can give them the information, but they have to make a call.
Yeah.
I think what we see is, you know, and perhaps there's 2 points that you're touching on. I mean, one is, if we go back to the original point about that, you know, supply demand of healthcare workers to deliver the care, we need to find ways to accelerate that learning to make sure that we have competent, safe, effective, you know, healthcare workers in the field delivering care to patients. You know, in the US, let's say it takes, I don't know, 5 to 8 years to train a surgeon. In the UK, it takes about 10 years. That's a long time. It's a huge investment, and it takes a long time to get that ROI for the patient. And so we need to be looking at where safely and with quality we can accelerate that learning curve. And there's already enough evidence that's showing that inputs, you know, bringing human and technology together can accelerate that. there's already evidence that shows, video performance metrics can accelerate learning curves and drive down, variation or harm to patients. And there's evidence that shows that by bringing together, I always say this at Prox, we want to bring the best of human expertise with the most advanced technologies to save lives. And I think that's that medium that we should be aiming for, that almost very seamless interplay between human and technology that's going to really help us shift to that new pattern of healthcare. You said if we had a blank canvas, what would we design it to be? Because ultimately there are things within a clinician's or a healthcare worker's day that can be automated, that can be driven through algorithms, supportive decision making, like you said, how much blood, getting more real-time inputs, and equally really starting to shift this opacity of knowledge and data. I can speak for the OR, there's a huge amount of opacity of information. How do we make that more transparent? You talked a bit about the information. We still don't have that, all the patient information. You go through different systems, it's all linked. We need to start to connect those dots, but we should be shifting and aspiring to that world where we do bring that seamless interplay between human and device, or human and technology, or human and robot, where it can augment and play its role, but I would say not replace the doctor, but definitely augment and accelerate what we can do.
As I take us out here, I've asked each of my guests today, and I will tomorrow, the following question. And David, I'll start with you on it. What are you most worried about over the next 24 months in the healthcare system?
In the US, our rising cost and the ability to keep up with all the costs, it's continuing to skyrocket. And the more we bring new technologies there, the more we bring patients that can be solved for their health issues, the more costly we get.
Yeah, aren't we just graduating patients to more complex diseases because in the past they just died earlier? Really, that's what we're doing.
Very much so.
Well,
it's extension
right,
of life.
the balloon angioplasty helped stop the widowmaker, and then the stent stopped that, and then the aortic valve and mitral valve repair replacement stopped that, and we're kicking everybody downrange to heart failure now. So our efficiencies are actually causing a bigger burden and a bigger cost on the back end of this. So it's a really complex, interesting quandary we're in. We're graduating more people to living longer to put a bigger burden on the healthcare system. So what is your biggest concern?
I would say, well, two things. One is, I'm definitely, seeing this firsthand, the burnout and the ability for us to scale care. So, we've seen a mass exodus of, healthcare workers, nurses, doctors that have been really burnt out. Their sort of mental well-being during this time has been difficult. So I want to make sure that we can actually continue that inflection point that I described, that we bridge that, and we need to embrace solutions, like Proxima and others to try and do that. The second I would say is inertia. I mean, one of the things that we did see was, I guess one could call a silver lining out of COVID, is that we were able to accelerate and push through the adoption of some innovation and technology that historically there was a lot of friction. And we were getting optimistic about the opportunity to really start to disrupt a pretty complex system, healthcare. And I'm concerned that that sort of starts to wax and wane, and that we see inertia sort of picking in again, the systems turning back to their complex ways and their sort of traditional ways. So I hope that that appetite to grow and disrupt continues, and that healthcare leaders and their hospitals and health systems and IDNs continue to push that narrative or that strategy as a key strategy for how they redesign or reimagine healthcare for the future.
You bring up COVID, and I just want to, again, one more question before we go out. How important is the shifting centers of healthcare to the home going to be, and is the consumer patient ready for that?
Huge. We have to decentralize healthcare. We saw it firsthand. The traditional big central bricks and mortar approach, everyone comes into that, is just not the model for the future. It's about pushing care closer to patients' homes, closer to their support infrastructures, remote monitoring, digital technologies, empowering patients with tools in their hands, whether it's on their iPhones or their digital solutions. So this is something we're seeing quite a lot of, and the systems were completely burdened when COVID hit, and I think it's really made us think, how do we accelerate support like dialysis closer to home, or other needs, diagnostics, point of care testing. All of those models I think are important.
You do a lot of strategy for companies. What are you seeing right now on the shift to home health, and is it here to stay, and is the patient consumer really ready for that complex relationship?
One of the silver linings to this horrible COVID cloud has been the understanding of how we can access and treat patients outside of the acute care facilities by necessity. We didn't want them accessing the facilities. They were going to get exposed. They were burdening the system. We wouldn't be able to take them through procedures because we looked at them as optional, and they weren't, but they needed this care. So we've learned how to deal with patients outside of the acute care facilities, and I think that was a really great lesson for all of us. All of this digital technology that was getting a little bit of a look-see for a while is now getting implemented, and I'm not going to say everybody is going to succeed, but at least the clinicians are starting to adopt. They're trialing, and they're saying, brought supreme value, not for me. So that's what the COVID has brought to us. And yes, we're right down the road here, Scripps, they have a chief medical officer just for hospital at home, bringing patients out of the acute care facilities, being able to treat them. ASCs booming around the country. Let's do these not highly complex inpatient surgical procedures outside of the acute care facility. Let's set up just surgery and home. It's going to expand exponentially in the next 5 years, without question, in my estimation. And everybody that we're seeing, and I would say all of the large commercial entities are asking us, project this, and how do we set up to take advantage of it? You asked, are patients ready to take care into their own hands? No, they need a lot of involvement. And we can give them the tools, but they're still going to need involvement. It's just a change in the way that they access their clinician and their relationship with the clinician and the people who are directing their care. We have a lot of other companies that are setting up care models that are alternative to just the physician-patient interaction that can facilitate that understanding of the patient, how to maintain their best care. So I'm very hopeful of that shift.
I think even with that decentralization, we're going to see how that might even impact all the surgical backlog as well. I mean, it's one thing about monitoring and supporting patients with care at home. It's also thinking about that just immense surgical backlog that happened. I mean, we're years behind where we need to be with that. And so we're going to have to think more laterally about scale, delivering that care, and bridging that gap on the backlog. You've got patients who've been waiting years for a hip replacement, a knee replacement, things that are going to affect their activities of daily living. And we need to try and address that.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for this. I love the 20,000 view foot and the strategy of the health tech, med tech industry. And both of you bring a lot of value to our viewers. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
We got it. This is Joe Mullings, LSI 2022, Dana Point. Be well.